In this video, we'll explore dynamics of freedom and imprisonment within the paradigm of meaning. And to begin the conversation, let's look at the container of language. So every word is a container. And so the container is initially empty. It's just a sound. Sex, money, slut, gay, good, bad. These are just sounds. They mean absolutely nothing. They're just sounds. However, if we take a word like gay and we combine the sound with different heuristic messages, so we watch someone, like I'm 46 years old as an American, and I watched how uncomfortable men were around the word gay. And so the amount of discomfort that I've watched fills in a symbol. So there's all this density as I'm trying to make sense as a young boy growing up. What is it about this word? Because it's obviously, the word gay means happy and gay. So why is everyone becoming so uncomfortable around happiness? So this is a mixed message. So you can see there's some schizophrenia. You can also see, so there's discomfort, there's also fear. I would say that growing up, probably, there's more open reactive fear to the word gay than war. It's kind of interesting that, you would not see American men respond with fear or reactivity around the idea of going to Iraq, where they had a high likelihood of developing PTSD and participating in the murder of innocent civilians. More than 1 million innocent civilian Iraqis were murdered with the U.S. invasion. And many more were given PTSD in the search for a non-existent weapon of mass destruction becoming a weapon of mass destruction. The U.S. military is and was a weapon of mass destruction to more than 1 million human beings, giving many millions more PTSD and damaging the reputation in the United States. But that didn't bring anxiety the way happiness and gay, the way two men being affectionate with one another, which is apparently the essence of the word gay, that rather than a male and a female being affectionate, that a male and a male would be affectionate, either in a bisexual or a homosexual framework, depending on whether the men in question enjoyed being affectionate with women as well as men, or only with men. And so it doesn't make sense, but it's so riddled with fear and anxiety that it can't be talked about, and people are not very honest about it. So you see that all of these different observations are being built up. And the way a child learns is by, first of all, what's this whole weight coming from? For me, as a little boy, I'm looking at the world as a small person. And why I'm interested in learning from the big people is that they're still alive and they've got more resources and more power than I do as a small person. I depend on them. They don't depend on me. They've got more freedom and power. They've got more security of survival. They've got more perhaps love and belonging, more respect out in the outer environment. And so I'm wanting to learn from people who are more successful than I am as a small person. And so the way a small person learns is by copying, assuming that the big people got things figured out and copying that. Now, that's a generally good assumption for a small person, that the people who have been around longer and are bigger must know something or they'd be dead. That's correct. But particularly before the rational brain is brought in place, and this comes, ties into the fact that certain things around the taboo nature of sexuality, you can't bring in a rational brain unless you're willing to talk about something. And so if your parents won't talk about it, and your teachers won't talk about it, and your friends' parents won't talk about it, but they all exhibit these weird, uncomfortable body languages, changing the subject. We don't talk about these things, or just looking away or glancing quickly at one another. The accurate observation of a small person is that this is a bigger deal than nuclear war. What if there's a nuclear war, Dad? Well, that is a possibility, but this is something you can talk about. And Dad's not squirming. Mom's not squirming. You see, so gay is a sound. It's bay, say, gay. It's just a sound. But it's the sound that apparently has the entire cult tied up in irrational knots that are so upsetting that they cannot be discussed by the rational brain. And so, a child, an infant, a teenager's obvious conclusion is that this is a really big deal because it's a really big deal. See, and here's where we get into the self-referential loop of every cult. It's a big deal because it's a big deal, and that's why it's a big deal. But why is it a big deal? Well, it's a pretty big deal in a Christian cult if God, who happens to be sadistic and a bit of a bully to his enemies, but sadistic and a little bit of a bully to his friends. I mean, you can pick being burned in damnation or burned to eternity for being gay, or you can pick wandering around in the desert for 40 years looking for the promised land. With over a 40-year period, about how much of the group died waiting for God to reveal, to his chosen people their home in a desert? How many died? So if half or 2/3 of the chosen people died after 40 years of wandering around in a desert before God got around to showing a home, or you're burned for eternity, it's it's not necessarily a great outcome, but nonetheless, all I learned was that it was a really big deal. It was one of the biggest deals that I was aware of physiologically, and you can't sort it out until you find someone who can talk. You can talk to about it. Now, so that's the physiological weight of a word. So there's all this discomfort, and the presumption is that these people know more than the child. So presumably they know something that really bad that could happen that you just don't know about. And none of us like the fear of the unknown. It tends to be bigger than the fear of the known. The fear of the unknown is one of the deepest human fears. So by not talking about something, it grows in impact. And then you hear or see, well, I heard and saw, movie clips about people, young men attacking gay men, or violence against gay people, or illegality. So then there's news around the word again. This is illegal. Then there's, like, I remember being at the Findhorn community in Scotland, taking a workshop on creating your own reality. And I was, I think, 13 around age 13. And it turned out that one of our workshop members was gay. And when this became known, there was a woman who said, "I knew it. You were withholding from us. You should have told us." And this, she was really upset that this gay man had not declared himself as gay in front of the group, as kind of a warning? Wasn't entirely clear. And he said to her, did you declare that you were Christian or not Christian? Did you declare that you were heterosexual? She said, no, of course everyone's heterosexual and stuff, but it's not normal to be gay, so you should have let us know about this. And I remember the male that had been hanging out with this gay guy was instantly upset and confused. So he was now questioning his self-image because it turned out he had become friendly with the gay guy. So this changed everything. So he saw himself as a different person in a negative light because he'd gotten close to a gay guy. And then people were angry at the gay guy for not declaring his gayness. And nobody's explaining this to me as a 13-year-old, like, what does all this mean? But I didn't want people to be angry at me, so it didn't seem like it was, a safe topic to bring up. But this is at a metaphysical, kind of New Agey type community. So again, it just sunk in that was probably the most intensity that I witnessed throughout the whole, where it's all, it's a workshop on creating your own reality. And this is the big, kerfuffle of the weekend. The next was around money, because there was a fun game called the Money Game. And the gay guy won the game by taking everyone's money. It was wonderful. So perhaps he had his revenge against being lambasted for his sexual preference. Nevertheless, again, it's a really big deal. Now, I also learned when, I had kind of decided philosophically, I started thinking about this, that if there was an intelligent God out there, that he had better criteria than, whether or not two men gave each other pleasure or loved each other, as some, killing children. There's got to be higher things on the hierarchy of evil other than men bringing happiness to each other. So that was one thing. And two, it seemed a little materialistic, a little, odd to have such an obsession about this. And then it also seemed constructive. It's like there'd be more love in the world if two men loved each other versus the same two men didn't love each other. Because just taking away someone's gayness doesn't necessarily generate love for women. It just takes away their gayness. And being gay doesn't take away the ability to love women, whether or not you're sexually attracted. And so there was all these little rationales that basically said, in my mind, gender shouldn't matter about who you like. But rejection matters, particularly as a teenager. And so I felt somewhat lonely. And while I didn't feel gay, I think I've always been more attracted to women. I did ask a boy, around age 14, 15, if I could hold his hand. And I thought it would be nice. I liked him, and I thought that would be nice to hold his hand. And he looked mortified and then avoided me. And that had a big deal, because I wanted to be liked by him. And what I had just learned was that suggesting a form of sensual affection was going to damage that. But I also learned, he couldn't say why. And he didn't say why. He just avoided me. So it put it into that taboo thing, what is so horrible about holding someone's hand that it cannot be talked about and that you have to go out of your way to avoid an interaction? And no one would explain that. And so I think for me, the highest charge was around being associated with a nameless taboo. And I think the reason that that's hard, particularly for an abused child, is that a traumatized child who is then shamed for being traumatized rather than the trauma repaired, as with every child in human history, makes the world about them. Every child is a narcissist, is self-centered, because narcissism and self-absorption empowers. It creates an illusion of power for the child to compensate for the actual incredible powerlessness that a child has. A child is completely and utterly dependent on the giants around them, and as such is, incredibly vulnerable. But a child compensates for that literal vulnerability by pretending that it's all about them. So if mom left, it's because of me. If dad left, it's because of me. If I got, if the sun shines, it's because of me. A child is very self-referential and narcissistic, and appropriately so. They're learning to survive. They need to be focused on themselves, and they are. But as a result, nothing gets to be about anyone else. And so, when I and many children were traumatized and then sent to their room for demonstrating the symptoms of being hit, being beaten, being whipped, etc., which is, screaming and dissociation and things like that. So then is sent away for exhibiting the symptoms. If you traumatize someone and they're a healthy human being, they will protest and cry and express how painful it is. But if you're sociopathic, then the solution is not to heal the pain or stop beating a child. It's to get them, to send them away, because the message there is the giant is more important than the little one. And so what does a child make who is in tremendous pain and loneliness and fear, in a traumatic state that has been sent away? Well, my conclusion as a child was that I was bad, was that I deserved it, that it was my fault, and that's why my parents were a bully. That's why my parents were sociopathic. That's why my parents enjoyed hurting me. And this is a normal childhood reaction, but it's also one of the most dangerous, because from that moment forth, in a peak emotional state, which is a very intense creative state, I'm deciding that I'm bad, that something at the core is unlovable and deserves to be punished. And that goes in as an object, as a psychological object. And to be bad, to deserve to be punished, and to be punished, and to be traumatized, and then humiliated and shamed for the symptoms of that trauma, is the most painful thing that I've ever experienced on this earth. It's tremendously painful. And then to be banished in that state, in a state of severe loneliness, grief, the loss of innocence, the loss of self, the loss of safety, the loss of love, to be banished in that state is absolutely horrific. And this gay thing seemed to be kind of in that same order, that this was unspeakable. But when these unspeakable things up and there's no rational mind, the worst fear, way down at the bottom, the worst fear is that somehow this is linked to that. That if I'm gay, then people will know that I'm unlovable, so unlovable that it can't be talked about. And so there's this question like, is it that? And then whether it's that or not, the question is, it's too dangerous to get near that. Now, why is it so dangerous to get near a belief that I'm bad, that I deserve immeasurable amounts of trauma and pain, and that it will make good people happy to see me suffer? Why is that so dangerous, so destructive as a belief sealed in at a high intensity of emotion and felt physiologically, believed physiologically? Well, one of the reasons is that the brain likes integrity. There's an integrity bias that is self-referential. You can see it in politics, where if someone believes that this is the way it is, whatever it is, and you present that person with data, whether or not the data agrees with the bias or not, the presupposition, the preconception, the belief, the person doesn't change their belief and walks away more convinced than ever that they are right. So that's a tremendously powerful force in human beings, that whatever it is we believe, we continue to believe it and act consistent with the belief regardless of the data. We also, and this creates a loop that's then very difficult to escape, because whatever we believe because we believe it, and that's why we believe it. That's a self-referential loop. And if it's something that strengthens regardless of what the data brings, then it's a very difficult spiral to get out of. And so if you can't get out of a spiral, it becomes important that it's not a downward spiral. If you're in a plane and it enters a downward spiral, and you can't get out of the spiral, you're dead. And so it's important but if you can't get out of the spiral, because for one, as soon as you believe something, you notice all the data that is consistent with your belief. And you tune out and notice the flaws in all the data that's not consistent with your beliefs. Now, imagine doing that with the belief that I'm bad, that I deserve to be punished, and that my worst possible state makes good people happy because I'm bad. Well, what kind of tailspin can be realized that? Because you can then pick selectively data that seems to support that. This parent was afraid of me. In the United States, if you're, a young male and you play with children in a park, you have 10 or 20 seconds often before the parent looks at you with the look that basically says, why are you interested in my child? Are you a pedophile? Or are you going to what? What is it exactly that the statistics, say that makes it so difficult for parks? Because the actual reality is that you are 400% more likely to be, whether it's kidnapped or molested or abused or killed by a family or close family friend or your relatives, basically, than you are by a stranger. So, if anyone's to be glaring at anyone, it should be the strangers glaring at the parents for having a high statistical probability of abusing their children and not being competent parents. But this isn't the way the cult works. The way the cult works is the parents with these high statistical odds of abusing their children actually glare at the strangers who have 400% less likelihood of being involved in their child's abuse. But, facts have never stopped us before, so why should they get in the way of our biases against the fear of the unknown, against the stranger now? And so, when I get that look from parents, there's no answer to it. They're like, don't you, you horrible person, don't you cross the line, don't you play with my kids. It's a cult phenomenon, because when I go to Thailand, for example, the exact opposite happens. I play with the kids, and the parents smile more and are happy that there's an intelligent person who realizes how wonderful their kids are. which is true. An intelligent person feels greatly enlivened and refreshed, with the energy of children. And, what's the big deal? And I'm sure if I had kids, it would be then I would go into a different package, of stereotyping and the like. But nonetheless, this belief that I'm bad, deserve to be punished, and that good people will enjoy watching my suffering is not at a rational level, because it was never rational in the first place, number one. Number two, the rational brain is not really developed before age 6. So these events happening at 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, they're happening, off the charts in terms of, the impact on my psyche and body in an innately self-absorbed state. So it's got to all somehow be about me. And it's interesting that these types of abuses early on can lead to regression, can lead to, an age being arrested, where the intensity of the fear and pain is so great that some part of you stops going forward and is lost or captured in that moment of terror. Because when you dissociate one part of yourself from another part of self to manage the pain, the dissociated part of self is not a part of the situation. And so it doesn't grow. It would be as if you have a class of 10 people, and one of the things that went on in the classroom was so frightening that one of the people ran out of the classroom and decided never to come back. Now, the other 9 students continued to learn, but from the moment that the one student ran off to avoid the crisis of what was occurring in the classroom, maybe a teacher was humiliating a student or humiliating them in a shaming way, and so they left. From that moment, that 10% of the self, or that one student, isn't learning anything, is not growing up. They're waiting to be hit. They're protecting and frightened, and they're no longer absorbing the data as the rest of the class progresses. As the body and what remains in the psyche of present personas, continue to grow up, the part that couldn't deal with the pain and dissociated at age 6 stays 6 years old. The rest of the self grows up because it remained in the body. It remained present with the event, but some part of us couldn't deal with it. And so, given that all children are self-absorbed, and rightly so, and all adolescents are self-absorbed, the more we abuse our children and adolescents to a dissociative extent, where they feel they have to literally tune out, dissociate, leave their bodies, get out of the space to block it. Well, those parts remain fixated in a self-absorbed narcissistic state and never grow up. That's how you can get 20 and 30-year-old grown-ups, they've grown bodies who aren't adults, who are actually children in adults' bodies, and they don't know how to grow up because they don't know how to do the traumatic recovery. And so, the word gay brought up this fear that somehow this, whatever it was, that was so horrible that my parents needed to hurt me, that people would just find out and then they would hurt me and laugh and find that funny or take pleasure in hurting me. And that was just, too much. And so it became a traumatic thing to consider So particularly at, age 15 or so. Now, it's very important to understand that these biological triggers and reactions can be disintegrated from, conscious rationale. So, long after deciding that an intelligent adult would put a high-quality friendship and relationship ahead of gender, if you're intelligent and one person is a really good friend. Now, what's a good friend? It's someone who has the ethical competency and the relational competency to truly want what's best for you, number one. And two, to have the skill to do that, to behave consistent with what is best for you and your well-being long term. To sincerely be happy that you're growing, you're becoming your best self, your dreams are coming true. That's a friend. Someone who naturally does that and does it well. Now, the idea that you would throw away a good friend in favor of gender, meaning here's a woman who is narcissistic, hasn't a clue, hasn't even thought about what's good for you. She's busy with her own stuff. And here's a male friend who's actually a competent friend. And the idea that you would say, well, that friend is male, so his love is, unchristian or evil or whatever. But that self-absorption is female, so that's good or something, is patently absurd for an intelligent person. But for a traumatized Christian who grew up the way I did, and the hitting and all that wasn't about Christianity, but my parents identified as Christian and talked about, God and Jesus and all of that, while traumatizing us. I mean, so we've got some schizophrenia there. For a Christian who believes they'll be burned alive for this or that, then something like this is a really big deal. It becomes too big to look at, too big to think about. And that's the trap, is when your body is so filled with messages that you won't survive, that you won't belong, that your human needs will not be met by the giants. Your survival, your security, your love and belonging, and your validation. Your opportunity to develop your gifts, your opportunity to bring those potently into the world as an equal, and your opportunity to become part of something bigger than yourself, that all of that will be jeopardized because you're bad and deserve to be punished by giants who can kill you and seem happy to make you suffer. That whole dynamic then gets linked with some of these words. And we're not free. We're not free. So this is the prison and the imprisonment, because once you have a trauma that is so painful that you do not know how to show up for that traumatized moment with love and empathy for that, in this case, little boy. Once the trauma is so big that I think about that moment and then I shut down and I look away because I don't want to be in my body when I'm being hit by a giant that's supposed to be caregiving. And I don't want to go crazy by a giant that's talking about love while hitting me as a giant. that I depend on. I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to be traumatized. I don't want to be re-traumatized. I don't want to feel how absolutely lonely and horrible that feels, the way that little boy feels. And so I turn away from the memory. It's too painful. And, and different words get added in on top of other words. So, as I talk about this now, one probability would be to grieve and weep for the lost innocence of millions of children, of which that boy is one. That's happening today, that it's happened for thousands of years in our cult, and that we're immune to it, meaning we've numbed it all, we've walled and sealed off the grief, so we're not feeling it. And it's happening in our neighborhood today, like it always has. One would be to wail, to grieve that. But then there's all the shame for men around being sensitive, being emotional, being vulnerable, being out of control, losing it, meaning falling into a deep feeling. And to be shamed in that amount of grief also feels lonely and frightening. To be shamed in that amount of pain and grief rather than to be joined, to be dissociated from. There's a man who's not behaving like a man in our cult. So because he's weeping over the loss of innocence, we're going to turn away and abandon him in that state, with the shame that real men wouldn't do that. Real men would be sociopathic and not feel anything. So the problem isn't the meanings. The problem is the exposure to this deep level of traumatic pain over that in the child's body is linked with death. The child wasn't sure they were going to make it because they're so small and the giants are so big. And the giants can kill the small one if they want to any time. And that's, the child desperately wants to be valued, to be welcome, to be needed. So we live in a cult where it's not okay to weep around that, to talk about it, to remember it, to examine it. And that you may be ostracized for doing so. And that's sad, but that sadness is also taboo. How you doing? I'm doing great. That's the cult-sanctioned veneer. But what's going on at 2 years old in so many of our bodies, in so many of our psyches? Now, once there is a pain mass down here, number one, that is too big to deal with, and that seems to be associated because often, the message is, first the abuser hits you, so you start crying. Then the abuser hits you and tells you to stop crying, or he'll hit you again. And so the message behind that is your expression about your deepest pain is so unimportant to me and to the world that it is a crime, that you will be hit again and again until you stop existing, stop feeling. Stop being a human being. And what does a person do with that message? Other than hide and bury. But this is a terrifying state for a young person. And nobody, at any point in the maturation process, wants to look at this mass of pain and hurt down here. They don't want to look at this. So what do you do? You move on. You pretend it's not there. But then with things like this word gay, maybe they're seeing that. Maybe it's too close to this thing. And then it just gets turned away. Now, the point of bringing this all up is that, this whole matrix of physiology, you see, because there's no discernible link between emotionality and physiology. Your body produces feelings, and your feelings change your body's sensation. I can tell you to feel wildly enthusiastic and visualize that, and your body chemistry will change if you're able to visualize. And I can tell you to feel depressed and visualize that, and your body chemistry will change. There's no difference, there's no gap between a feeling and the physiology. And when you have traumatic physiology that is linked with probable death, that's what makes it a trauma, and is linked to, follow the rules, don't talk about it, it's very difficult to get that out of one's body as an instinct in a traumatically illiterate cult that traumatizes its children, but then doesn't teach the parents or the children how to heal the trauma or recognize it or talk about it. And when the child was punished more for communicating the pain, and they really learned that the pain, talking about the pain was taboo. If you then ask a grown person to talk about their pain, it may be a 6-year-old inside that says, I'm going to be killed if I do. I'm not going to do it. And so the grown-up feels this massive wave of fear of a 6-year-old. And hears the voice and says, no, I don't want to do it, or it's fine. So until you can face the fear of death, the fear of being unlovable, the fear of being alone and abandoned forever, until you can face the cruelty and see the cruelty of your bullies, of the dark side of your parents and relatives and friends, of your cult, of your media, until you can see the sociopathic cruelty coming towards you as a child, which is a tremendously traumatic thing for a child to realize. Imagine that you are 40 pounds, 30 pounds, 20 pounds, and you understand that you absolutely depend on every one of the grown-ups around you, or you will die. Well, to feel any sense of security, you need to project that these parents know what they're doing, they're good people, they'd never do any, they don't make mistakes. You can't say I'm completely dependent on a fucked up sociopathic moron who, is barely holding their life together and has a sadistic streak that could burst out at any time and murder me. You can't rest and go to sleep if you're 6 years old in a giant's house. And you understand that? And so the understanding is obscured, and the incompetence of the grown-ups is transferred over to oneself. Well, in that dynamic of transference, They look perfect. Mom and dad, they're perfect. It's my fault. Mom and dad are perfect. It's my fault. Well, if you acknowledge that it's not your fault, that your parents can be sadistic and cruel, it's for that traumatized 6-year-old, that's terrifying to realize. They don't want to look at that. They don't want to look at the cruelty and incompetence in the cult. One, because the cult will attack them. You know, if a 6-year-old tells the average parent, look, you're scarring me with shame, you're inducing complex PTSD, you're a hypocrite, you're a liar, you know, you're emotionally illiterate and you're abusing me, and I'm the only one who's innocent here. I didn't decide to have kids, you did. I didn't decide to marry this woman, stop calling her my mother. Own her as your wife. I didn't choose her, you did. If a 6-year-old says these things, the parent may withdraw in shame and not want to look the kid in the eye, and then that'll get transferred on as their unlovability. Or the parent may rage, don't you talk to your parents, and beat them half to death, if not kill them, because it's too painful for shame-based parents to own the mistakes that in a shame-based paradigm has to result in them being punished and being bad people, the same way that they are punishing a 6-year-old to transfer that shame over to a younger generation. Now, coming back to the reality of the situation, gay is just a sound. It means absolutely nothing unless you give it meaning. So if you want the freedom to let words and paradigms and phenomena be responded to rationally and with intelligence, like you do the math yourself and figure out objectively who you want to be and what makes sense to you, regardless of what anyone else thinks, well then, do you have the courage to face the 6-year-old that is afraid you're going to die if you do this? To remember and face the trauma of the abuse, that in that frozen, dissociated state is still happening for the 6-year-old. To confront the ignorance and stupidity around you. People who may not want to buy things from you, may not want to sell things to you, may not want to be your friends, won't invite you to the party, may not give you a promotion, may not want to date you because you're crossing a taboo line, because you're not fitting in with the norm. Because norms have always been crazy. They're usually highly outdated and highly self-referential. So their main legitimacy comes from the fact that the last generation did them, and their legitimacy comes from the fact that the generation before them did them. And at one point, there was probably some half-baked link to something that was intelligent at the time. But is almost always outdated in the present. Even the thing with being gay, if you're in a small tribe, as many small tribes were, of 12 to 150 people, if you're in a small tribe and children are dying at the rate of 5, 2 out of 3 kids are dead by age 5. Well, then the idea of, some of your tribes people being gay and not having kids could be an imperative. The tribe is going to die out. We don't care about your sexual preference. Have sex with one of these women so that the tribe can continue. It's the grandfather's wish, whatever. There may well have been a time when, we cannot afford survival of the group identity and embracing love. In the same way that different places in the world today that are very poor say that romantic love is not a big deal. You have to marry for status and money. If you look at China in the arranged marriages happening today, it's the discussion between two parents about money more than do the kids actually like each other. And so it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that occurring at one time in the past around being gay. But here we are in the 21st century where there's overpopulation. We're not going to die out because, too few kids. It would be beneficial until we get our ecological act together to have a few less children, particularly when there's so many abused and abandoned children who need parenting that don't have parents. So in that framework, being gay and adopting has flipped from a potential liability, threatening the tribe, to an ecological benefit. But cults never update their logic. It's a very sleepy phenomena to just fall in love because that's what we did and that's what we did and that's why we did it, and don't talk back and don't ask questions. We're your parents because I said so. And if your parents repeat the crap that they got from their parents without any examination, the because I said so becomes incredibly, toxic. So as a human being, to be free, our body is packed with messages that say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, or you'll be expelled, or you'll be cast out, or you won't be loved, or God will hate you, or whatever. And then you'll be alone and lonely forever in this horrible place and deserve it. Every person has tasted that place at some time. Anyone who's tasted it, particularly people who have been traumatically induced and left there, would rather die than be lost in that place psychologically. And it's in the body. And when you would rather do anything other than face that pain, face that fear, you can now be manipulated, because every child who's been traumatized in that place vows, prays, begs the universe, please, I never want to feel this way again, never again. I'll do anything to avoid feeling this. And that becomes the liberation in the moment, because no 6-year-old can deal with trauma. And if you're stuck there, you will go insane. So it's the short-term freedom is to dissociate. But it's the long-term prison, because all the cult, all your friends, all your lover, all your therapist, all your priests have to do is bring up this issue. That's all they have to do, is bring this issue up again and confront you with that specter of that horrible feeling. And as soon as they bring it up, you'll do anything to avoid it. And this is one of the ways that cults perpetuate their self-referential insanity so effectively, is induce the child early on into the state of absolute terror and horror, then threaten the child to be put back into that state anytime they do not do what they're told, and deflect all healthy criticism and challenge to authority with a simple message, because I said so, and might makes right, and I will punish you if you don't do what I say. Now you train the child, the adolescent, to be in service to avoiding their fear rather than living their life. And we have the kind of cult we have today. Tremendously frightened, tremendously anxious, depressed from all of these things, and no permission to challenge the cult, because what you're supposed to do is to hide these things and then pay someone a lot of money to listen to you and keep your secret. They're called therapists. But you're not supposed to talk about these things in a public way, or you will be shamed with new words, sissy, or blabbermouth, or a girl, all the curses that you can think of, which in a chauvinistic cult are all feminine. But for a boy to be then moved towards being feminine is to court humiliation. So social death, financial death, sexual death, eventually physical death if nobody will connect with you because you're shamed for being feminine in your peer group. And women and girls are just as chauvinistic as men in a chauvinistic cult. They shame their own femininity and the femininity in men as something to be humiliated and ostracized and disrespected. So you have to be, going back to the freedom, the things that hurt us are not words and sound. The things that hurt us are destructive beliefs that we believe and associate with words and sound. And the key thing is that we believe it. Because even if the cult has moved on, even if we're now free in a grown-up body, if we still feel terrified and small in this domain, then we're not we're not free. We're still believing the messages that we internalized and got before we had reason. It takes work. It takes skill to face our deepest fear, to face our fear of death, to face the traumatic memory, and liberate the child with love and care from that situation to be the competent adult and parent we never had, and to give that gift to our inner child and adolescent. So that when we hear a word like gay, it can just be two people who like each other. Or money can just be bits of paper that are useful sometimes, rather than you're smart or you're dumb or you're a jerk or you're a better sexual lover or you're a threat or you're cruel or all the things that money means to so many different people. It's just a word. And ultimately, while it is our parents and our cult that imprisons us in the trauma of shame, in the trauma of insanity, in the fear to do what we want to do and think the way that we want to think, in the fear that leaves us putting our authentic self aside in order to embrace the dogma of a cult that traumatizes us if we don't, we are the only ones that can get ourselves out of that prison and to decide and reevaluate and say, no, that was an incompetent parent. There was nothing wrong with my 6-year-old. And find that 6-year-old in that moment and give him the love so that he can afford to take that personally. A 6-year-old will always take personally what's going on and make it about themselves. So if you can release that trauma and pain in meditation, in visualization, and love that 6-year-old, now the 6-year-old must be lovable. It's still outside validation, but now it's outside validation and externalization or internalization of a healthy parent, which means that they must be lovable because it's all about them and because you are loving them. And so in that way, we can get back a very important freedom, which is to be who we are and have it mean the things that it means to us, regardless of what it means to anyone else. And there are still parts in the world where, out of fear of physical violence, we may conceal the meaning something has to us because we're around fear-based, shame-based, sociopathic people who cannot tolerate difference. But we can still be free on the inside to know what it means for us and be comfortable. This is what it means to me. I like myself. I like my definition. That's the weight that I give it. These are my beliefs. Because ultimately that's what shapes our lives, the meanings we give things and our beliefs. It's a powerful thing to become more free, to regain a freedom we had as infants and was taken away from us.